So a very, very warm welcome to everybody. We have people joining us from around the world this evening. Want to extend a very hearty welcome to both Ian Wright and Mary Bolingbroke, who are going to take us through some explorations, a little bit of theory, a bit of practice tonight, and a bit of overview, sharing some of their experience and perspectives around developing palpatory precision. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to first hand over to Ian Wright. Warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So, why are we here? We actually already did a course quite a few months ago now with you guys, where we were starting to introduce some ideas of learning this whole process of becoming, in some ways, more precise, more specific. And why? Why are we doing that? The reason why, for me, is it's all about the potential for what we can do, the actual potential for what we have within what this great gift of what we can work with, and with the incredible natural potency that we have at our hands, the natural inherent forces within a patient, and the breath of life and the tide, and specifically some of these embryonic fields, these biodynamic fields, which we can learn to engage with. And in doing so, the potential for what we can do is phenomenal. I get astounded every day with really the potential of what we can do. And so what we're doing here is we're kind of explore this a little bit, these ideas tonight, just as a kind of introduction, because we're doing this course where we're going to do much more practical stuff on July the 3rd and 4th. But we're also teaching, actually, again, on a mother and baby course later in the year in October. So these are going to be times when we can start to explore some of these themes more and more. So first of all, let me just say who we are and how we come to be here. So Mary and I both went to the British School of Osteopathy in London. It's called University College of Osteopathy, I think now. And we both qualified in 1992. But actually, we first started teaching cranial osteopathy together at the British School of Osteopathy in 1993. And we've been teaching ever since, actually. So Mary, I just want to give a little introduction to her. Mary teaches biodynamics, biobasics. She teaches a diploma in pediatrics in Ireland. And she, for some years, taught the principles of osteopathy at the British School of Osteopathy. So she has a very broad view on especially the philosophy of osteopathy. And anyone who knows her knows that she has a very broad view, a hugely broad view. She can take in huge perspectives on things. So that's why we work together, because I like micro detail and she likes big, expansive ways of looking at things. So for me, I'm a fellow of the Southern Cranial College, and I teach on the diploma in pediatrics in Ireland. And basically, I've been teaching pediatrics and cranial work for, gosh, nearly 30 years now. It's amazing. And the way we work changes. And nowadays I'm doing kind of mentoring and doing remote sessions, treating the most complex things worldwide. Everything is so worldwide now. It's amazing. But a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching on a diploma in pediatrics in San Marino in Italy. And it was just so wonderful to be engaging with these children again and working with them. And I just thought, wow, we need to get back to doing this hands-on work as well. So what we're really going to do here is just start to explore some themes, to explore where osteopathy found its way into working in this dimension through looking at how Sutherland went on an odyssey, a growth of understanding, and looking at other threads that have come in, like, for example, biodynamic embryology, and looking at these formative embryonic fields, these perfect unerring forces that are present through life and we can attune to and engage with them in extremely precise ways. For me, it's all about scope of what we do, looking at wiring, the way that the central nervous system develops, but also how it wires up very specifically and how it gets pruned, and how we have opportunities within those moments to actually have huge effects. So looking at, and special areas of personal interest for me are looking at these elements in relationship to specific children with specific learning difficulties, dyspraxia, sensory processing disorders, autistic spectrum children, who are my favorite, and how we're going to be looking at how the brain changes and how it rewires itself, prunes itself, and almost goes through a reformation in a teenager. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sleep and the incredible, actually, in neurodevelopment, the importance of sleep in neurodevelopment. And so we're just going to give little introductions. I think Mary, I saw Mary logging out. I thought she was going for a cup of tea. If not, I'll just carry on. But so in the end, we're looking at the real, for me, to really hone our skills and to be extremely precise when we're working, especially in the field of the developing brain, where we can actually really feel how these biodynamic forces are creating and informing the brain in the moment, not when it's first formed, but actually to some degree throughout life, and how the brain still can fire, wire, prune. This whole process of starting to learn to not just to talk about this, to actually really feel this, and actually learn to really feel that how these forces are working and how the brain is going through this incredible growth and development and continues to do so. So this is a little bit of an introduction to that. And well, I think I'm going to let Mary start by talking. Mary, are you there? Not quite yet.
Yeah, just to say, and it looks like Mary's connection has dropped, and I've just had a message that she's trying to get on her way back into the meeting. So,
oh, fine. Well, I'll carry on talking for a little bit.
That would be great. She's just coming in now, so maybe give her another minute or two.
Yeah, I'll let her.
Yeah.
So, if we begin when we start to look at how we begin with a wholeness. The conceptus is a whole. And this undifferentiated wholeness, where nothing is separated, nothing is differentiated, but from this wholeness forms everything. Structure, function are all formed. But in relationship to that, we are always looking at this underlying wholeness. I was having a discussion actually with a practitioner who I was mentoring yesterday in America, and talking about, if you're working with people or children who are really unwell, how can you not take on or resonate with them? And we had a long discussion about how this is. And for me, one of the most important things was about always having a deep connection to this inherent wholeness, which is perfect, this perfect behind all of these threads and these patterns, these genetic, epigenetic, toxic metabolic threads, which have in themselves fields. Underneath that is the perfect blueprint. And if we align ourselves very deeply to that, and the more deeply we align ourselves to the underlying blueprint, the easier it is. It's not so taxing on the patient, number one. It's not so taxing on us, number two. And the potential for what we do just becomes exponential. Mary, are you around? Nearly. So what we...
There we are.
Oh, here you are. Did you pop off for a cup of tea?
No, I did not. My computer froze me out, and I've had to use my phone, which is absolutely fine by me. But anyway, apologies. What have I missed? Catch me up.
I finished the whole thing. It's all done.
Oh.
I'm joking. And so I just introduced you.
Thank you.
But it's recorded, so you could, yeah. I didn't say anything bad as far as I know, and just talked about a little bit about what we're doing in terms of just we're taking a little glance here at the developing brain, and we're going to expand on it obviously at later times. And I was just beginning to start to talk a little bit about wholeness from the conceptus point of view, and then I thought you might want to talk a little bit about Sutherland, maybe, or osteopathy development.
Yes, I'd love to do that. So we all, Ian and I practice as craniosacral osteopaths, and a lot of us also practice as craniosacral therapists. So I think one of the places that we could start is just exploring that term, craniosacral. Where did that come from in the first place? And then, we're going to add in where the bit biodynamic came from as well. But let's just start at the beginning with William Garner Sutherland, who was born in 1873. And he was already studying with Dr. Still, who was the originator of osteopathy. And when Sutherland was 25, he was at the School of Osteopathy, and he happened to see a skull that had been displayed in a particular way, where all the bones are separated and held in a three-dimensional space. And he saw the sphenoid, which is the bone just behind the eyes. And it struck him that they were beveled like the gills of a fish. And in a split second, he suddenly thought that that beveling indicated that there must be a mobile mechanism for respiration. And this was, for him, an absolute eureka moment. And he spent the next 30 years experimenting on himself to prove whether this was indeed the case. So the experiments initially in the first 20 years involved him, amongst other things, lashing wooden bowls to his head with leather straps to see what would happen if the bones of the skull couldn't move. So he'd had this understanding that they did move. So he thought, right, I'll prove that they move by locking them up and seeing what happens if they don't. Well, after his wife had come home several times and found him unconscious on the floor, he'd made himself temporarily blind a few times, he ended that avenue of inquiry. But by the time he was 56, so this was some years later, he introduced the cranial concept to the world. Now, in those days, it was still a very mechanical model, and it was based on the idea that the tissues, but especially the bones of the skull, could lesion. So what he meant by that was that they could be exaggerated out of their normal position. But of course, that meant that they could be very, very carefully and gently, but firmly and scientifically brought back to their normal position. Now, by the time Sutherland was 63, so this was in the late 1930s, his concept had developed a bit more, and he'd understood that the bones of the skull were actually caught in ligamentous structures wrapped around them. And if he palpated very, very carefully, he could feel the central nervous system beneath that coiling and uncoiling, and that the bones of the vault moved in the way they did because the bones of the cranial base were moving beneath them. Now, by the following year, he was working with various other osteopaths by now, and he and his colleagues had developed this understanding of something that they called the core link, which in other words is what we now call the reciprocal tension membrane, which is this membrane that lines the skull, forms the faults in the tent, lines down through the spinal column, and then connects to the sacrum. And that you could use that link to work with the sacrum from the skull or vice versa. And in fact, you could have fluctuations of tissue fluid because of those membranes. Now, so this is where by now the term craniosacral comes from, because we've got this connection from the bones of the cranium to the bones of the sacrum. 5 years later, he was really starting to notice the importance of the tissue fluids. And if the fluids weren't moving, then the whole system would start to lock up, including the spinobasilar symphysis or spinobasilar junction. So the fluids themselves could lesion. Now, he was still using force to discover these laws. He was still using bands to restrict fluctuation, presumably under strict supervision from his wife. But for the first time, he starts to mention a spark. There was a spark that animated the system, and he could see it, which must have been quite a discovery, especially after he had, temporarily made himself blind and temporarily knocked himself unconscious, to then say, "Oh, I'm seeing sparks of light inside other people's heads." By the time he was 70, he'd been working with this concept for 45 years, and he started to explore not just using palpation, nothing else. And he developed the idea of the breath of life, this breath of life that was palpable within the patient. And he would have been familiar with that concept, the breath of life in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." So for Sutherland, the breath of life is this supreme potency, and he sees that it arises from outside the patient and it flows into them, and it's that which provides this initiative spark for the central nervous system and for the cerebrospinal fluid. So over the next couple of years, his techniques changed completely, and he understands that he can work with the central nervous system and the cerebrospinal fluid by compressing the fourth ventricle, and that will help initiate that spark. And there's a sense of vitality in the tissues that he calls potency. Then then he was 75, and on April the 12th, 1948, there was a major change. And there must have been, mustn't there? Because why on earth would he remember the dates so clearly? And he stops motion testing and he just uses gentleness. He realizes that if you compress the fourth ventricle, you can remove lesions. But if you don't, if you let the fourth ventricle soften and expand, then there were textural changes in the whole sensory experience. And he realized that he was able to release lesions using only the breath of life, allowing it to flow from the outside, perfusing the tissues in what he then termed the tide. And possibly even more excitingly than that, as if that wasn't amazing enough, he realized that this potency had an intelligence and a decision-making skill of its own, and it could be directed. And he realized with great clarity, and he said, this is no idle cream. He was able to diagnose and treat just using the potency, the tide, still points. And he realized a little, it's relevant to what Ian was just saying. He realized that one becomes reverent in the presence of these phenomena, and that reverence must become an aspect of the treatment. And Ian's going to be talking about precision, and that's one of the things that Sutherland understood. He said 10,000th of an inch may be all you need to get a huge change in someone's system. And you would think, well, how can we work with that degree of precision? But of course, we don't have to be doing it all. We're working with this incredible, intelligent, event in the face of which we have reverence. So Sutherland said, get as far away from your physical touch as possible. Instead, sense deeply into the tissues, and that will lead you to the primary site of the lesion. And from then on until his death, when he was 81, he deepened his understanding and reverence for this amazing system. And exactly as Ian said, he said, every drop knows the tide. There's always wholeness. There's always oneness. Every single drop knows that wholeness. So that he was the founder of the journey that we're all on. That journey took him his whole lifetime, and we compress it into our career. But that day on April the 12th is very significant for us, because that day was when he stopped putting any influence in. He stopped being afferent and he started just being efferent, just receiving. So I think that's probably enough about our founding father, upon who
I just want to reverse the afferent and efferent though.
Oh, please, have I got it the wrong way around? Efferent is when it goes out. Afferent is when we receive.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. That's okay.
I mean, honestly, after 30 years, you wouldn't think that would be a problem, would you?
So, I mean, I remember when we were teaching on on the 5-day courses and teaching at the undergraduates, especially on the postgraduate stuff, and we were motion testing.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating teaching motion testing when we never did it. So you can do it, it's easy enough to do, but it's like, what is this? It's funny, isn't it? Because we kind of came in, didn't we, in our own journey, working with people who were alive with working with potency, and then obviously stillness and all of these things, so we kind of jumped on this train almost within ourselves, hadn't within our journey, where we were working at this edge of it, which is absolutely beautiful, where we started. And so picking up the thread here of this underlying wholeness, Dr. Eric Blechschmidt was a German anatomist, born in 1904, somewhat contemporary. And he wasn't considered that important until a lot later. Even now, he is becoming considered, and I'll tell you why in a second, because at the time and later on through a lot of his career, the importance of genetics and gene coding became the key. Everything was about genes and gene coding. But nowadays, when we're looking at cell biology, epigenetics, and some of these more modern fields, there's been a developing interest in Blechschmidt's work, not least in our professions. And one of our colleagues, Jim Jealous, was looking at Blechschmidt's work some time ago, and what he realized was he could feel, this is what he was feeling. And so what Blechschmidt was talking about was this witnessing of the embryo as a functional whole, perfect and fully functioning with its environment, moment to moment. And through these biodynamic and metabolic fields, the embryo unfolded within wholeness. And Jim recognized that this is what we were feeling, when we're learning the motion of the motility of the central nervous system, everything moves towards lamina terminalis. That's true. But actually, when you start to feel these, when we're starting to work with feeling the precision of these fields unfolding and how they continue through our lives to restore us to this perfect blueprint, we've got this incredible sudden tool. So this kind of a biodynamic metabolic field is really like a locally ordered metabolism, which is involved with nutrition, oxygenation within the cell, but actually to the cell, via which creates the oxygenation needs, create a blood supply, a developing blood supply. But then there's small chemical, diffusional, and movements, and these movements create a metabolic motion. So we have motion, and this unerring, perfect motion that forms in the most perfect way each time is created by these local changes in metabolic needs linked to position, and position changes and function changes and anatomy hence changes within this. So you could say that from this original stillness there is motion. And for example, if we're looking at the heart, as blood is forming and starts to flow, it creates canals, canalization. And these canals form tubes. And these tubes fold in a particular unerring, perfect way. And they create the heart. So from stillness comes form. And form, flow, a biodynamic or metabolic field, an embryo dynamic field, if you like, creates motion and form. So now we have another thing that we can add to this dynamic, where we have stillness, we have potency, we have the breath of life that acts on these fields and creates the potency by which everything is formed. And so the world kind of opens up to us, really, in a much stronger way. So as each organ develops, changes position, it's like a functional developmental motion. So these fields of function, for example, work in particular ways and create certain fields of function, like a suction field, which creates the liver or the lungs or the glands, or compression, contusional fields, which, for example, compress themselves into discs or the anterior spinal dura. So what we're wanting to do is to learn to feel these imprints of these fields. It's like there is the field creates the motion, the motion creates the form. And so what we found over this time, especially it's very important in relationship to anything, to the formation of anything, to treating, for example, bones that are not healing, the fracture's too bad, and actually realigning ourselves to these developmental fields and finding this inherent blueprint that lies there, this field of perfect unerring wholeness. The bone can remember how it was formed, and then boom, the whole thing starts to re-engage. And so it suddenly becomes extremely potentized. But this is really important. What we're looking at a little bit here is how that functions in terms of the central nervous system, and how, by aligning to this and finding this way, where there are things that have affected that perfect unerring, there are a series of things, I'll talk about that in a bit, that can affect this perfect unfolding, how we can get behind that and to support almost the finishing off of the job. So Mary, I'm going to talk a little bit about the central nervous system development. Or not.
Well, what I actually wanted to do was see if we could show that little video of the embryo uncurling, but my computer has taken the evening off. It might be possible for Michael to show it, so if so, that would be marvellous, and if not, we can just think about the development of the central nervous system. And there's a technique, Ian, that you've showed us that I think is very nice, because it allows one to go back to the earliest development of the central nervous system, where we're just a bilaminar disc, and then that disc is divided by the neuropore, and then you've got a trilaminar disc. And I think there's a practical that you've talked us through, where you imagine yourself as the central nervous system lying on that sort of developmental plate. So that's one of the very earliest connections that you can have to your own central nervous system, where you can imagine yourself as a trilaminar disc, really, and feel that potency within you. And then we know that the central nervous system coils and uncoils. Oh, I think Michael has just said that it might be possible to see the video, which would be marvellous.
Just when you're ready, Mary, I can try and get it up on my computer. Just indicate if that's helpful. It may take just a few seconds of messing about a little bit, but I should be able to do it. So just let me know if that's helpful.
Give it a try now. Let's push the boat
try
out.
now. Okay, well, let's give it a try now. And
we like the emergence of originality in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what do you see on your screen?
I can see it.
Enter full screen. I think now I just need to...
If you press there, that should do it.
Yeah, there we are. So if you want to talk it through, Mary, or just, yeah.
Well, I won't talk because I think it does it itself, doesn't it? You can...
Voila.
Yeah.
Shall I stop sharing, Mary?
Yeah, unless anybody wants to see it again. And I think as you watch that, you really start to get the understanding of a flexion movement and an extension movement. And you see him or her curl right up in one phase. And then there's the stretching and extension in the other phase. Oh, look, Thalia would love to see it one more time. I think it's beautiful. So this time when we watch it again, watch the flexion and extension, and then remember what Ian was saying. So remember, if you were curled up forward, there would be not very much movement there, would there? And there would be a stretch at the back. And then the amount of nutrition that could get to the posterior area would be restricted by the amount of pooling at the front. So then it would reverse. And then you'd start arching backwards and opening up the front. So exactly as Ian is saying, the provision of nourishments causes growth, then the growth outstrips the nourishment and you get more growth somewhere else. So let's watch it again with a view to that flexing and extending and see if you can watch the brain doing that. We're making Michael really work for his living today.
It's like we're willing it on.
It's conception, isn't it? It's just like, we can do it. We can provide that initiating spark.
Ignition, yeah, we're in dynamic stillness and we're waiting. No, we can't see either.
No. So I think when we're talking about wholeness, that was really what Blechschmidt realized when he was working with the embryos. He understood that no system, the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system, the nervous system, could not and did not exist independently of the rest. At any stage, it didn't matter if the conceptus was 3 hours old or 3 weeks or 3 months. At every single stage, it was impossible to define it as anything other than absolute wholeness. So although Ian and I are talking now about the central nervous system or the cardiovascular system, in actual fact, when you're working, you are working with wholeness. And so there were 2 terms that Blechschmidt defined. One was biokinetics, which is the embryological movement of the whole, and the other was biodynamics, which was the forces that created the whole. And when Jim Jealous read Blechschmidt's book, The Ontogenetic Basis of Human Anatomy, catchy title, Jim realized that these biodynamic and biokinetic forces that Blechschmidt were describing were still present and was still creating, and most importantly, was still palpable, not just in babies or children, but in adults, in absolutely all of us, which is why he took the term biodynamic, meaning holistic, originating, embryological developmental forces, and he added it to the word osteopathy or craniosacral osteopathy or therapy. And sadly, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to see the embryo being whole, but let's just remember that when we're looking at the development of the central nervous system and we're trying to feel it and work with it, we're looking at this coiling and uncoiling movement. And then as you work with that, you start to understand that there are different qualities. And a bit later on, we're going to be doing a piece, reading out something called The Tour of the Minnow, which was written by Sutherland. And it's an exploration of the ventricles in the brain. Now, remember that we've just talked about tissue fluids and the cerebrospinal fluid, and we've talked about the fourth ventricle, and we've talked about the brain itself. And this is a way of looking at those 3 pieces. And remember that when you start to work with this potency, you can refine and refine and refine your vision. Except we've used the word vision. And for some people it is quite visual, but for some people it's a sensing. So let's just understand that we're working with receiving information, as Ian was saying, we're working afferently, we're receiving information. Now, how can we say that we're going to work with such extreme precision that we might be working within a tolerance of 1,000th of an inch? It's because we learn how to feel the resonance of something. We learn how to feel a harmony or a dissonance, perhaps. And we've got colleagues who work with various nuclei in the brain, and you think, especially when you're learning, you think, well, I'll never be able to do that. How is that going to be possible? But as you learn to work with these, with this wholeness, it's like having a sort of magnifying glass, isn't it? Where you can focus in, as it were. It becomes very willing to show itself to you. If you look with reverence, you don't look as if you're raking through somebody's sock drawer. You look with you don't. Although I have been treated by people and I think, well, that feels like they're raking through the sock drawer.
I always love your metaphors.
If you sit with reverence, it comes to you because it wants to show you, because it knows you're there in wholeness, in reverence, as part of the same being almost. And you're offering up whatever type of fulcrum it would like. And as Ian said, if you're saying, let's go back to the beginning, let's help you right from the development of this part of your being. I think one of the most beautiful gifts Jim Jealous gave us are just the two words: the emergence of originality. If you just held those two words in your mind when you're working with the central nervous system, or indeed any part of the being, you come to this place where you understand that originality is emerging and emerging and emerging and emerging, and it never stops. It never stops. It's like a wave, just breaking, just breaking, just breaking. And there's a stillness in that constant emerging. So when you work with the central nervous system, think of that, the emergence of originality, the continuing emergence of the blueprint. So I think over to you before I witter on too far.
All right, am I turned on here? I think I might. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, fine. Yeah, and you weren't wittering on too far. I was enjoying that. Thank you. I just was thinking about that whole idea of, if you're teaching the development of the eye, these whole idea of growth blinks. So every action, every motion that the embryo undertakes is part of a functional motion that actually, the grown or the fully formed child takes these incredible developmental functions. But I'm just wanting to look a little bit in, if you just open the microscope a little bit up, a little bit more, and look at the process of neurulation, neural programming, pattern generation, synaptogenesis, and myelination. These areas are areas where we are afforded a great deal of potential when we're working, because this is how the nervous system micro-develops. So, for example, neurogenesis starts at the 3rd week of life, and it goes way beyond the end of the 1st year of life. And there's a lovely technique that I teach on one of the variety of courses, maybe we'll do it on this one, where you look at, because the final cell division of the neurons happens at the lateral ventricle walls, before it's laid down, before it fires itself out, like this migration of neurons in these kind of radial glial tracts, which are like spokes on a wheel. until they are layered down through these 6 layers of the cortex, from the inner cortex first, and then you go out through the layers of the cortex. And if you go back and you start in the stillness in the lateral ventricle and look at this memory, this field memory, embryodynamic memory, cellular memory as well, of this neurogenesis, it can afford great scope when you're working with developmental delays, even with post-trauma like hypoxic ischemic events in newborn, etc., because you're going back into the memory of this. And that's just a kind of an example. You know, there's 100 billion cells, neurons in our brain. When we're developing, 250,000 developing every minute. Incredible. And then you have this idea of synaptogenesis, this wiring, firing, wiring. And that starts at week 5 and continues way beyond the second year, the most part within the second year, finishing. But we still form synaptic generations every time we form a memory. So we're always still doing it. And there is plasticity afforded even in an adult brain. And you work with plasticity, potential plasticity, which is supposed to not happen after you're 4. Obviously, the most plasticity comes at sub 4 years old, where the brain is still in this process. But you can work with the way the brain can form plasticity around it. And it's a fascinating area. But, you know, the cortex overproduces synapses double as much as we need, and then we go through this whole process, because it starts as a very diffuse wiring, but it's primed back and primed back. You know, children lose 20 billion synapses a day. This whole idea of use it or lose it is really important. It shows this incredible potential plasticity of the brain. So you've got the embryo with its biokinetic and biodynamic motions, this inherent, unerring perfection unfolding within a field in the moment. And from that, you have firing, wiring, programming, connecting up, creating patterns between parts of the brain which create function. And this whole, you know, the wonderful gift that we in neuroscience has been given is functional MRIs, where you can see these patterns of function and how different parts of the brain wire through and connect up to create patterns and coherence of function. And this is this gives us incredible scope for when we're working, you know, because you have this perfect unfolding, and then you have the idea of teratogens. Teratogens are agents that can affect perfect neurodevelopment, because the central nervous system is the most vulnerable of any system to external influence. And it's developing from 3 weeks old until mid-late teens. So there's huge scope for it to be affected. And, you know, for example, alcohol, the teratogen of choice, that's called, and how it can subtly affect neurodevelopment, and or subtly or even strongly. For example, if you're looking at the susceptibility of the developing cerebellum to alcohol. So the brain is particularly vulnerable to alcohol at the very beginning, of course, and actually towards the end, where the cerebellum has a vulnerability to it. But you've got a whole different variety of, let's say, fields that can have an effect on this perfect unfolding. Infections, maternal vaccinations, stress, corticosteroids, for example. And then you have vascular events, or even subtle. A lot of the work we're doing is looking at subtle vascular events that haven't, you know, you haven't got clear hypoxic ischemic But there are subtle effects, and we often spend a lot of time looking at vascularity and how it's been subtly affected at certain stages. So what we're trying to do is we're learning to identify what has affected. Number one, I'm quite like to be diagnostic. What's affected this perfect unfolding? You know, is it the birth? The birth has an effect. It's not all about the birth at all. A lot of it is prenatal and how it is subtly influenced by all these different factors. But what we do, as I said before, is we go behind that to looking at how are we going to support this perfect unfolding, even if this child is 3, 6, 96. It's all, there's always potential when you engage with these processes and these fields. Anyway, that's all I want to say for now. I'll let you talk.
Should we move on from there a little bit to another bit of the brain? Should we think about the autonomic nervous system, for example? And I really love the way that the Stephen Porges' work has become so well known now, and his work on the social nervous system. And it fits in brilliantly to the work that we do with people and children. So originally, the autonomic nervous system was seen as a two-part system, and everyone's heard of the flight or fight sympathetic system, and then the parasympathetic, which is the vegetative, rest and digest, classically. And Stephen Porges, with the help of his wife, realised that there must be a middle road and another pathway. So when he looked, he found that, of course, yes, there we are. The parasympathetic system arose from the dorsal vagal complex, and it's part of the oldest bit of our reptilian brain, and it's vegetative and metabolically conservative, and it mainly controls organs below the diaphragm, and it has some branches to the heart and the bronchi. And under threat, there's a strong surge of activity in the dorsal vagal complex, which slows down the heart rate and leads to immobilization and freeze and feigned death, which is great if you're a crocodile. But it is still working in human beings and people, and under massive threat, that immobilization can be lethal for mammals and people, who can literally be frightened to death. The other side of that coin is the sympathetic part, and that arises, as we know, from the thoracic spine. Highly adaptive and metabolically extremely expensive, and it upregulates organs for activity. So that under threat, the sympathetic nervous system, in conjunction with the hypothalamic pituitary axis, prepares for flight by forcing blood into the legs, or fight by pushing blood out into the arms, and mobilization. And of course, if that is sustained, it just burns your system out. Now, what Stephen Porges realised was that there was a second division of that vagal parasympathetic system, which he called the ventral, because that's where it came from, of the spine, and he called it the social nervous system. And what it does is it helps promote social interaction and group behaviour and verbal and non-verbal communication strategies that promote safety and ultimately survival. And this whole system is constantly working, and it's called neuroception. So what is constantly happening, whatever situation you are in, your social nervous system, which consists of cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, 10, and 11, is monitoring. It's monitoring the sound, how close people are, how loud they're being, their body posture. And as it does that, it sets up a response. So if I go into an office, or say I went in, if I wasn't an osteopath and I turned up an osteopathic practice, I would be monitoring the entire environment to work out how my body should respond, how much parasympathetic activity is safe, how much sympathetic tone do I need. Now, there are two possible responses, really. One is a positive response where it feels safe. So I can relax, I can become more expansive, I can engage, I can be cooperative, and I find that I'm involved in a community. If I apply that approach of openness and engagement and cooperation, it has a remarkable effect. It improves my health. My immune system improves. My whole health improves. Not only that, if I use that system of working with someone who comes into my field, we're far more likely to have a diplomatic resolution to anything that crops up. In fact, if I use that response to someone who's being very difficult, if I can manage it, they are more likely to move into a positive neuroceptive response. On the other hand, if we do that the other way around, and I go into an environment and I think, this feels really threatening, it's very loud, I don't feel safe, that person is moving in an extremely unusual way, and I don't really like it, I set up a very different system. It's far more sympathetic, a rise in sympathetic tone. It leads to, in long term, if I was in that environment for a long time, say I was a child in a home situation that was difficult because my parents were halfway through a horrible divorce, it sets up fear and fatigue. That can lead to a sense of isolation. Isolation can lead to either depression or anger. That can lead to, anger can lead to aggression, obviously, we know. Depression can lead to self-harm. This makes one very much more vulnerable, more fear, more fatigue, more isolation, and the immune system becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and one is more likely to become unwell. What relevance does this have? Well, of course, it has a colossal relevance to us as practitioners, because we want to make an environment that is conducive to the other person going into that health strategy. And it's also important for us, not just as practitioners, but to understand where we are in these two different modes of being. Thirdly, if we're working with teenagers, remember that Ian was saying that there's this huge growth and development of the brain. I'm going to be talking about teenagers in a moment, but their brain at one stage learns and grows by mirroring. It does not make some of these parts of the prefrontal cortex of its own accord. They are created by mirroring the behavior of people around them. So it becomes incredibly important that as adults, as osteopaths, as parents, as members of the public, we mirror to young people how we would like to all behave so that we engage in a social, communal, empathetic way with diplomatic resolutions to things. Because if we do that, we are far more likely to be able to create that health environment, not just within young people, not just within a family, but within a community, within a society. So let's just review that a little bit, because there's one last thing I want to say about this. So we've got the ventral vagal system, which is the one that we want to aim to be working with all the time. That is based around orientating, engaging, communicating, and cooperating. One step down from that is the sympathetic nervous system, which is about mobilizing, which is about increasing your metabolic rate, which is about flight and fight. And one step further down from that, we've got the dorsal vagal complex, which is about avoidance, withdrawing, freezing, and feigning death. Now, crucially, so the one thing that we all want to know is why that is important. And it's because if you start at the top and you're able to engage and orientate and communicate, and something goes wrong, you will step down to the sympathetic mode and you will no longer be able to activate, orientate, engage, or communicate. And if your sympathetic strategy doesn't work, you step down into avoidance, withdrawal, or freeze, or feign death. And you will no longer be able to use any of the previous strategies. Each step down turns off the previous strategy, which is very important for all of us to know. If we see somebody in an avoidance, withdrawal, freeze situation, which we often come across with patients, we might want them to be able to set up another strategy, but we have to use everything that we've learned to be able to allow them to feel safe before they're going to be able to do any of those things. Okay, so I think that's enough of a whiz round the autonomic nervous system. And if you come onto the course, we will of course be talking about each of these subjects in a great deal more depth. But this is just a little taster, a teeny taster.
And and I'm conscious that we want to do some little practical stuff, so I'm going to move kind of a little swiftly through the next bit. So
yeah, I think so, because it's going to be everybody's tea time in a minute. So yeah,
well, probably all in different countries. Yes. Anyway, so we've got sensory development, we have connection, we have communication, synaptogenesis, developing neurogenesis. Communication bleeds empathy. We have challenge in our social environment. So social and sensory stimulation create neurodevelopment. They develop us. You know, I mean, you could say that cranial naves 5, 7, 9, etc., are to do with our social development. But actually, all of the cranial nerves really are part of it. Our eyes are olfactory. Everything connects our senses. It connects our cells. We go out into the external world, and as Mary says, we react either to nurture or threat, and that wires us up very early on, and we develop empathy. And as the brain is wiring up from very basic reflex, cord level reflexes to subcortical wiring up, for example, the thalamus, and then the limbic system, and then finally the cortex wires itself up, myelinates. These patterns are generated and they get hardwired into our behavior, and hence this is our place where we have a great potential input, because if there is a disturbance in that from the greater environment, teratogens, etc., or the emotional environment, trauma, etc., we start to be able to find a way through this. And on the course, certainly, we're going to look at very specifically about how that works in sensory processing disorders, and an exploration of the complex and wonderfully potential area for us to work with, which is autistic spectrum disorder. But sleep is very important and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, is sleep, because sleep is hugely important in neurodevelopment. It's absolutely key to it. So we have these 4 different sleep cycles. We have non-REM, light, deep, shallow, and then we have REM. So deeper sleep is much more involved with pruning. That's why of synapses. That's why teenagers spend a lot of time in deep sleep. REM sleep is to do with memory process formation, dreaming, emotional process, procedural memory, how to do things, and connects us up very early to our circadian rhythm. It's been linked to early brain development, especially complex social behaviors. And it's fascinating that a baby goes up to 12 hours a day the week before it's born of REM. So it's firing up because you're in faster brain waves. You're not in the slow brain waves, you're in faster brain waves. And the brain is patterning through this. And so how the importance of sleep and the paucity of sleep in some of these social emotional developments and these complex social behavior is really important, because it is about refining sensory processing and regulation. Regulation is, I'm sure Mary will talk about it, regulation. I spend a lot of my time working with children who have difficulty in regulation, because you're actually forming complex external social networks while you're evolving complex internal networks. They reflect each other. So, for example, children who have ASD notably have 30 to 50% reduction in REM, which is incredibly and difficult. And also, if in fetal alcohol, mentioned that before, actually it crosses the placental barrier. REM is suppressed in both time and intensity when there is alcohol, for example. So, and newborns slip into REM just after feeding. Newborns have 50 to 50 REM to non-REM, and then the REM gets much less until we're late childhood, and it goes down to 20%. So we're only starting to understand and learn about actually sleep. And then we have the deeper sleeps and how that is very much involved with pruning of the brain and contextual. So, but then there's all this other recent stuff about glymphatic pathways and shortwave sleep and the way that the blood volume to the brain is dropped by 10% in shortwave sleep. And shortwave sleep seems to act to facilitate this connection between the ventricles. So what happens is the cerebrospinal fluid moves from the subarachnoid space into the third and fourth ventricles in shortwave sleep in a very, very slow rhythms of about 3 cycles a minute. What does that sound like? It's very related, and it's a very interesting thing working with adults who have young age sorry, I didn't quite get that question. I missed that question. I'll get to that question afterwards. It was about ASD. No, I'm going to talk about ASD from a very wide different context, actually, but I'm just introducing it from a neurodevelopmental context here. But you can't bring it in all of the other threads when you're doing ASD. It's a big subject in itself. So you've got this slow waves of the brain, and actually when you're working with people, say for example, have early onset Alzheimer's, and looking at how sleep is affected and how this this cerebrospinal and lymphatic pathways are affected, and trying to restore the cerebrospinal fluid fluctuations, it's a huge area for us, and it's just an introduction here. So there's so much here that we can talk about. Mary, I think you should talk a little bit about introduce adolescence.
Yes. So as Ian was saying, historically people thought that the brain was mainly developing at birth and up until when you were about 7. And then they thought, well, that's pretty much done for the day then. They've got their brain sorted, and off they jolly well go, these young people. Well, then, as Ian was saying, with the advent of the functional MRI scanner, they could see that actually that original huge brain development of early childhood wasn't the only one. And in actual fact, there was a second brain growth development that was so colossal. It is called neural exuberance, and it takes the brain to an even larger size than an adult brain. So in as a teenage brain moves through adolescence, there is such an exuberance of neural growth and synaptic growth that the brain becomes more active and volatile than an adult. Then what starts to happen is that you get something called pruning. And then finally you get myelination. What is so important about this is that during this time of extreme growth and pruning, the adolescent brain is particularly vulnerable to stress. The teenage brain is more vulnerable to stress than at any other time. Not only that, the pathways that are pruned are the least used ones, because what the brain is trying to do is to create something that is effective and efficient and fast. So if you were to look at a roadmap, what the brain is trying to do is to shortcut lots and lots and lots of little tiny A roads and B roads and lanes, and it wants really good, fast motorways. However, and this is the really important point, it is, of course, the most used pathways that are myelinated. So you want the young person to use pathways like the ones that we've just talked about, like those neuroceptive pathways, the ventral vagal complex pathways. They are the ones that help generate the prefrontal cortex, they are the ones that we would really love to be myelinated. Now, we have unfortunately, until very recently, contrived a society that is extremely difficult and stressful for adolescents. We've made an academic situation that is very hard. We have managed to decide to deprive teenagers of sleep, even though we know it's absolutely crucial that they get a lot of sleep that starts later. When Ian talks later about sleep, there's a release of melatonin, which primes the brain to sleep. And it's released, I think it's like 2 hours before one actually falls to sleep. So for teenagers, they don't even get a rise of melatonin until about 10 o'clock at night. So they're not planning to fall to sleep until pretty late. But they need to sleep for a long time. So they need to stay asleep way past the start of school in the morning. And when they do experiments on school outcomes and results, if you start a child's learning day an hour later, you massively, is the blue light from phones and laptops? Yes, it does. Because melatonin, just as a melatonin is also produced in the gut as well as the brain. Just thought I'd mention that. You can sometimes feel it as you're falling to sleep. I know I sound like I've gone off a tangent, I have a little bit, but as you're just falling to sleep, if somebody wakes you up, you can feel a kind of lurch on the left side of your abdomen, and it's where some of the melatonin has just gone, whoop. Anyway, yes, you can improve school outcomes by starting school later. Young people, teenagers, were probably designed to be the most perfect night watchmen ever, because they're wide awake in the middle of the night, they love hanging out with their mates, and they don't really care if nothing very much happens, because they are primed to spot something unusual happening. So they don't mind if lots of nothing happens. They don't mind hanging out outside a shop where nothing happens, because there's the possibility that something will happen. Anyway, so there's 4 really big things that the teenage brain is trying to do in this great big exponential growth, pruning, myelination. I'm just going to talk about the 4. I'm just going to name the 4 of them, and then I think we probably head straight on to a little tour of the minnow, shall we?
Yes, I just want to say one thing before you do. I'll finish your thing.
Okay, the 4 prime directives of the teenage brain: highly receptive to new information, and the new information creates more exuberance, and the more exuberance there is, the more neural pathways there is, and the more desire there is for new experience and new information. So it's a bit like Ian was talking about the embryological development, where function changes the form and the form changes the function. The second thing that teenagers are really primed to do is to acquire new skills, and they have loads of dopamine which are going to encourage them to do that. And they love learning, being in the experience of something new, which creates more synapses and more neural development and more pathways being produced. They need to develop a different relationship with their limbic system and their prefrontal cortex. Absolutely crucial. Comes back to what we were talking about with Stephen Porges' work. We don't want the limbic system, lizard brain, to be in charge. We really want a different strategy. We want that strategy of cooperation and so on. And that gets programmed into the prefrontal cortex, also known as the wizard brain. The 4th thing is that we would like them to help reorganize and integrate the social, emotional, and cognitive processes with their ramifications. We would really love them to learn, and they would really like to learn the reason, the thinking, that thing about thinking ahead and thinking, I'm responsible for the consequences of my actions. Oh my God. Anyway, so that's what we'll be talking about when we're looking at the development of the teenage brain.
Okay. So I just wanted to say one thing. There was a comment that I just saw. I only had to scroll back to find it, and it's a relevant point, and I wanted to just pick it up. This person made a comment saying, won't you be looking at ASD from a more sort of potential and positive viewpoint than one as a kind of neurodevelopmental issue? And I just wanted to kind of respond to that because so far this week I've worked with I think 5 just in these last 2 days, children from all over the world with ASD. And where we're coming from with this work, which is the great joy, is we are supporting this unfolding wholeness. And I personally have a great affinity with ASD children. Sometimes they have challenges which is where we can support them into their wholeness. And that could be very much with regards, I'll use the word autistic then, with getting them to overcome certain anxieties, etc., that they can have. And some children, it's about supporting them to be able to communicate so they're not frustrated, if we can do that. So, but yes, thank you for that comment. It's very important because actually that is what we do. We're supporting this unfolding beauty in all children, actually, of all types. That's the wonderful gift of our work, I think. Anyway, Mary, I think it's time to do a tour.
Let's do that. So this is a bit like a meditation, really. It was written by Sutherland, and it's a way of exploring your own brain. So I think Michael might be going to put up a picture of a brain just so that you can orientate yourself, just in case you haven't really. That's the minnow. You're going to be that little minnow, and we're going to do an exploration of the inside of your head. So I'm just going to read it out, and you can sit comfortably. And here's the picture of a brain. So just in case you want to really orientate yourself, you can put one finger on the bridge of your nose and one finger at the external occipital protuberance. And if you just imagine a tiny little bead of light going between your fingers, you'll just come across at that pituitary stalk just about, and that will help you orientate. Okay, so here we go. In this tour of the living human brain, we're like a little minnow on a sightseeing tour. We're taking a swim in the cerebrospinal fluid with a little minnow who can crawl into crevices such as the entrance to the fourth ventricle from the subarachnoid space. As we look, we'll try to reason out some of the functions in this neural tube. We're taking a flight of the imagination. In this little swim, I hope to gain some understanding of the mechanical features of the motion of the pituitary body in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. I'm also seeking to understand the motion of the pineal body up at the back of the roof of the third ventricle. The little minnow plunges through the door into the fluid within the fourth ventricle. These doors, called the foramen of Magendie and the foramen of Luschka, that open between the body of the cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space outside the neural tube, and the body of fluid within the ventricles, inside the neural tube. They're the only open doors between the two bodies of fluid. What the minnow finds in the fourth ventricle is a corridor under the roof. Cerebellum lies above the roof. The corridor extends down into the central canal of the spinal cord and upward into the cerebral aqueduct. He feels aware of the fluid. He feels that it is doing something. Out of the darkness, he sees a light. It's like sunlight in a cloud or a reflection. There's a lot of light, but it doesn't touch the cloud. It reflects all through it. It also reflects some intelligence to the little minnow, coming from something invisible. This liquid light seems to lead him on. So he swims along with that knowledge, that information from his first dive into the clouds within the fourth ventricle. He dives down to the very bottom and becomes aware of the transmutation from the light to all the physiologic centers within the medulla oblongata. Then he swims around and drifts sideways until he finds a little narrow channel known as the cerebral aqueduct. It's hard to find his way in this narrow channel. Suddenly, he feels a little push behind him, and it pushes him through as he sees that the undulations of the wall permit it. Right under him is another undulation that must be the sphenobasilar junction, arching up and down, an undulation that follows the tide and sets him on course to the top of a big cavern known as the third ventricle. This cavern is full to the top with cerebrospinal fluid. He turns a bit and sees that this cavern is very narrow, and just above there's a little tube. It's the pineal stalk, and it runs to a connection with something called the pineal body. He sticks his nose into that tube and gets stuck. Suddenly, that body, that cone, begins to move up, and then it lets him go, as it has now flopped down. He feels the up and down action in that little pineal body. What accounts for this mechanical action, this flipping up and flopping down? The roots and tracts in this area and in the roof of the midbrain connect up with the roots of the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, the oldest part. This is the part of the neural tube that has neural tissue as its roof. There must be a mechanical principle in the area for the flip-flop of the pineal body to occur during inhalation and exhalation of the primary respiratory mechanism in a definite rhythm. When the little cone goes down in exhalation, it rests on top of the superior colliculi. While the minnow is still on the roof of the third ventricle on the inside, he sees a curtain that separates the chamber from the outside of the brain. He stretches his imagination so as to see the choroid plexus above it, stretched out in inhalation. Then exhalation begins, and the walls come together to make a narrow chasm again. In exhalation, that choroid plexus bunches up the way it is found in the cadaver, like the picture we're looking at. He feels the difference between inhalation and exhalation while in the third ventricle. It changes its shape from a V shape that's wider at the top, thus lifting up the bottom, to a narrow chasm that drops it. So he dives down to the bottom and meets the floor of the third ventricle, the hypothalamus. It seems to have a hole in the bottom, and he feels the movement up and down. This hole leads down, and he slips through to find himself in the pituitary body. Now inside the pituitary body, He's also in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. He's tired now, so he falls asleep when he settles down and is rocked as if he were in a cradle. When he awakens, he discovers that he can't get out. The pituitary body is strapped down by a diaphragm. He must find that infundibulum in order to slip back up into the hypothalamus, that is, into the third ventricle. This must be a special area with the infundibulum connecting the pituitary body with the hypothalamus. It seems to be a centre of some sort with many nuclei in such a small area. There's a lot of action here with all the rocking up and down and the motility. Oh, he sees, it's the sphenoid bone turning regularly that does the rocking. The motion must be important for all these working parts. As the little minnow swims up in the third ventricle, he hears a hum and feels that he should be careful as he goes by the thalami and the basal ganglia, because there is such a charge in these walls. He moves along and finds the end wall, the lamina terminalis. There are two open doors in this wall, intraventricular foramina. He pushes into the right one and finds himself in the right lateral ventricle. As he goes forward in this, he bumps into the frontal lobe, so he has to turn around. This whole anterior area seems to have become a superior area. It's where the neural tube folded up and back over along the top of the head. The next part of his swim is where the motor cortex of the brain surrounds the ventricle, where the orders go forth to tell something to move. At the back of the cranium, he finds that the occipital lobe turns again, downward and forward. The visual cortex is here, the part that does the seeing, close to the falx cerebri and the tentorium. The temporal lobe of the brain is tucked forward into the inside of the greater wings of the sphenoid. All of this lies above the tent. What would happen if this angle between the falx and the tent became acute and squeezed the visual cortex? Once more, he's in a place where he has to turn around. So he swims back along the right lateral ventricle to enter the third ventricle again. This whole swim has been a spiral path. The left lateral ventricle must have one like it. The cerebral hemisphere is folded up and over and back and forward from the front end of the brainstem. So where is the outside found in the middle? It must be in the great transverse fissure of the brain. The tentorium cerebelli is between the contents of the posterior cranial fossa and the occipital and temporal lobes. This place in the middle is where the pineal body lies upon the superior colliculi of the midbrain, on the outside of the neural tube. But our minnow is inside, back in the third ventricle, where he still has some fluid to swim in. He gets back to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct and finds his way out of the door and into the subarachnoid space, into the cisterna magna. There is a room to swim in this lake too. He can swim around the medulla oblongata on the outside and see the cerebellum like the bellows the blacksmith used to blow air into their fire. He can feel the tide coming in. The little minnow swims next under the brain stem and into the waterbeds that the brain rests upon. He comes up around the pons to go above the cerebellum and into the superior cisterna. And there he is again, right on the outside and in the great transverse fissure. He can see not only the pineal body of that little cone, but also the deep cerebral veins, the choroid veins and the cerebellar veins, all converging and entering the great vein of Galen just before it enters the straight sinus. Then the little minnow wanders around the outside of the hemispheres of the brain in the subarachnoid distribution of the cerebrospinal fluid, beneath the arachnoid membrane and outside the pia mater. He notes how closely the pia fits to the surface of the neural tube, carrying arterial blood. The arachnoid membrane spans across the top of the sulci and the fissures. This arrangement provides him with the fluid in which to swim. He thinks, however, that it is not much in some places, and wonder what would happen if that arachnoid membrane became locked down upon him while in one of these spaces. The space would get smaller, and he might not be able to get into all that fluid around the outside of the brain, or into the fluid on the inside of the spinal cord. Could he get around the medulla if it were jammed down into the foramen magnum? What would have to happen to produce that situation? He can see that if the occiput and the temporal bones were not working right, the tentorium would become locked, and the shape of the posterior cranial fossa would be changed. The shape of the jugular fossa would also be changed. Would these changes affect the movement of the venous blood toward and out of the jugular foramen? If the outflow of venous blood from the cranium were restricted, would you feel good or would you have a headache? What events might happen that would put a strain on the relationship between the occiput and temporal bones? Suppose a person were hit on the top of the head. Would that blow jam down on the fluid there in front of the pituitary body and around it? It seems that there are many spaces around the outside of the brain where the fluid should not be disturbed. What if the head became warped into a side-bending rotation shape so that one chamber of fluid became smaller and its like on the other side became larger? Would there be more fluid where there was more room and less fluid where there was less room? Could that situation be straightened out? Anyway, this tour is long enough. He's been inside the cranium all the time while touring on the inside and on the outside of the living human brain. And the little minnow has seen enough to provide thought for a very long time. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Cool. So, should we do a little tiny bit of a meditation for a minute? Where am I?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that was a beautiful meditation. Thank you. But I just wanted to just go behind that for a second. So, before and behind the form, there is the whole. This kind of this dynamic stillness from which the conceptus, the wholeness of the conceptus within the wholeness of everything is formed. So let's just try and get an experience of that, I think. So just close your eyes and just allow your eyes to get soft. Kind of feel a kind of quietness in your eyes. Let them relax. We hold such a lot of tension in our eyes, don't we, when looking at these little screens and reading. It's really lovely, isn't it? Just letting your eyes soften, let that dural tension, that dural thread, letting the eyeballs just relax at the back of the sclera. Now, just allow yourself to drop with your attention into this quiet place that's behind your eyes. It's like you're dropping into space. And this is one of a variety of ways to go to that kind of universal field. And as you kind of drop into that space, you start to kind of dissolve into it. And you become one with it. That's what you are. But we kind of become transparent to it. Just enjoy that dynamic stillness, that universal field of wholeness or oneness that's there. It's like a great stillness that we are part of. And just really slowly allow yourself to be reformed new. Your form to your edges slowly to come back. So from stillness is form, the perfect unfolding of form, which is you. And just allow yourself to return. Put your feet on the floor. And slowly open your eyes. Okay. I think that's it. I think we're done. I'm hungry.
So, what a beautiful, beautiful way to finish. Thank you, Ian. Starting in stillness and finishing in stillness. Just really want to express my warmth and appreciation to both Ian and Mary for their deep sensitivity in presenting this work. And you know, my observation around this sensitivity, but not only the sensitivity, but also the precision, is that, of course, Ian and Mary are wonderful teachers. They present lots of courses, but I really have the sense that their knowledge is born out of their clinical experience, that they are such great clinicians who are utilizing these formative forces to, you know, to support health and healing. And speaking from that clinical experience, I think is for me, just to say to both of you, it speaks volumes, because there's no substitute for that experience, for that direct experience of with these forces. So just thank you so much for sharing this evening. And I know we've just got little snippets of your profound knowledge, profound experience. For those of you who are interested, and for those of you who are also within reach of London, then perhaps we'll see you on the 3rd and 4th of July, I think it is, in London, for a weekend seminar where a lot of these principles are going to be unfolded together with practice sessions on the tables. A weekend that's open to all craniosacral therapists as well as cranial osteopaths. So also to say a very, very big thank you to all of you who have attended. We've had a great turnout of people coming from around the world in many, many different time zones. So really big appreciation to you. And if you have any queries, please just be in touch, and hope to see you sometime soon. So have a very good night, and thank you.